I'd like to start, first of all, just by going straight into some questions, just to set the scene and to give you a little bit of context, and to get you involved to start with. So, as I put these questions up on the screen, could you use your voting buttons, which are at the top of the participants window, to respond either yes, no, or not sure to the question which you see on the screen. Also, please feel free to contribute in the chat. I'm aware that a lot of the good stuff happens in the chat window in these kind of situations. So please do contribute to that. And I think hopefully Peter will be putting up the results as we go for each of these questions.
Just a minute, I think we're having, if people could not just click on the poll just at the moment, I'm having difficulty changing it into the A to C one. So if you could not click on it just at the moment, and I'll change it to A to C. Oh, it doesn't seem to be changing. That's a shame. I'm not sure why that is.
Could we just have it as a yes or no then, Peter, with the tick or cross for this one?
I think
and
yes.
Add anything to the chat?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, so yeah, from the responses so far, it's looking like the yeses are kind of outweighing the nos by maybe 3 or 4 to 1. Okay, great, that's good. This is just to get an idea and to get people thinking. So if we move on to, I'm going to move on to the next question. And the next question is, can you think of a project currently underway in your institution which aims to develop student and or staff digital literacies? And in this one, I'm talking really about a specific project rather than a unit or a department which has that as its part of its role. So a specific project. And again, the yes or no would be good. Wow, okay. So a lot of projects underway at lots of institutions, I can see. That's great. So it would be nice to get some of your ideas and some of your input as well. Great. Okay, we're going to go on to the last question. So this one is the one particular department or service which is tasked with developing students and or staff digital capabilities. Okay, so that's looking like, yeah, quite a few yeses there. All right, so I think what this shows is that a lot of institutions are trying to respond to what's being called the changing learner landscape. So the kind of vast impact of technology and connectivity and the fact that everyone has their own devices. They're looking for ways to respond to this and to starting up projects and various different initiatives in an attempt to react to this new changing landscape. Before we get started and before I actually describe the project itself, I just wanted to quickly mention the term digital literacies. And I'm aware that we could probably debate this for hours or days even, but we don't have time to go too much into detail about the actual definitions here. But just to say that for our project, we found these definitions on the screen useful, and these ideas about digital literacy being about practice and identity, about behavior, the fact that digital literacies are dynamic and they change over time, and they're situated practices. So this idea, if you like, as Paul Glister said, that it's about mastering ideas, not keystrokes, and perhaps even it's about both. But just so you know, this is what's informing our project really. Okay, so just to give you an overview, and I think at this point, if Peter or Ellen could put the link to our site into the chat window, that would be great. But there were three main aims for our project, for our Clued Up project, which we started about 2 years ago. Started by myself. I work for CELT, which is the Centre for Enhancement of Learning and Teaching at London Met, and also Chris O'Reilly, who works for ISS, which is the Information Systems and Services. And I think he's here with us, so you can give us a smiley face if you like, Chris. So our idea was to create a resource for students to support their development in terms of their digital literacies. And at this point, we were thinking about fairly generic literacies, which would apply across the board, regardless of which subject they were studying. Secondly, we wanted to create a small team of digital ambassadors from students across the university in order to help us co-create resources, so develop this resource further, to also work with us to design workshops for other students to develop their literacies and help them develop their literacies. And now, I've also got one of our digital ambassadors, Helen, with us here. So she's a third-year international relations student, and she'll be contributing throughout this presentation. Okay, so just moving on. When we started the project about 2 years ago, there was a lot of research, and in the years leading up to that, there had been a lot of research about the student experience. And a lot of it seemed to be suggesting that students were not entirely necessarily comfortable with using digital tools for study and learning. They may be very good at using them in their social situations and social life, but when it came to learning and for academic purposes, they were less familiar and less comfortable with them. We wanted to find out for ourselves whether this was true with our students at London Met. And so on the screen here, you'll see some of the types of questions we asked, and these are actually stills from a video which we produced at freshers' fairs and student conferences, where we would ask students some of these questions. And what we found seemed to back up what the research was saying as well. At this stage, I'm just going to bring in Helen, because she's going to briefly talk about her experience of digital literacies during her 3 years at university. So over to you, Helen.
Hi everyone, I hope you can all hear me. Reflecting on what Jim's already said, when I came to university, I actually felt that I had higher levels of digital literacy than probably most other students. But through my university experience, I've also noticed that a lot of digital literacy is not necessarily used in the classroom. And I think this has also been reflected in how little students and academics kind of understand and use digital literacy and what their levels of digital literacy are. And as a result, I think this has also kind of reiterated the whole emphasis Jim has made on digital literacy being seen as something that is only really a kind of communication and entertainment sphere, and not necessarily something that is used to aid studies or to help learning. But I'll pass back to Jim.
Jim, I turned your mic off, so you need to turn it on again.
Okay, thanks, Helen. So our research into the student voice really kind of supported one of the assumptions that we'd made, which was that students are not necessarily that familiar with using technology. We had a couple of other assumptions at the beginning when we started the project. What I'd like to do is just to go through to show you those three ideas and to see to what extent they sort of tally with your experience and to what extent you agree with them. So I'm going to put them on the screen again. And Peter, I'm not sure if the voting buttons are working at the moment.
Yes, they are now.
Yes, no. Okay, so if I could just ask you to agree or disagree, or either or option C, not sure, and again to carry on contributing to the chat window with any other ideas and comments. Okay. So a lot of you seem to be agreeing here. which is reassuring for us. Great. Okay, great. That gives them an idea. I'm going to move on to the next one, and this is another assumption where we consider digital literacies to be both generic. In other words, they're generally applicable across different subject areas, but also there are others which are more subject specific. Again, it seems to be a fairly large proportion who agree with that. Okay, good. And if we just go on to the last one, this is the idea that situating digital literacy development within subject areas and curricula where possible is better than a one-size-fits-all approach. All right, that's great, thanks. I think that there seems to be a sort of general consensus around those three ideas, and those are certainly some of the assumptions that we started out with. We've mentioned already the idea that students need support for developing digital literacies. Now, the second one, the idea of generic digital literacies. When we started out our project, we were designing, as I've said, fairly generic materials and resources to help students across the board. And the next phase of what we wanted to do was to create this group of ambassadors and to start running some workshops. Just on the screen now, you'll see a page from our Clued Up website. You see this is the type of generic skill that we were interested in. So, for example, digital study skills would look at things like social bookmarking using Diigo, Delicious. It would also look at other things like building personal learning network using Twitter and blogs and so on. And then there's also a strand about digital identity, so managing your digital profile, staying safe in terms of social media, using LinkedIn and that kind of thing. But we wanted to create workshops for students which we'd open out and offer to all students across the university. And on the screen now you'll see a Clued Up workshop poster which was designed by one of our students, and also another of our ambassadors, Linda, who was talking about how she uses Dropbox in this instance. The idea with this was to, just as I said, to offer the workshops across the board to anyone who wanted to come. And we used Eventbrite, and we had really a lot of interest on Eventbrite, so loads of people would sign up. But then when it came to the actual workshops on the day, the numbers were much more disappointing, so even single figures at times. So I think from this we started thinking more about how important it was to try to embed this kind of digital literacy development within subject areas, within disciplines. Before I go on to that final stage of our project, I just want to bring Helen in again, and she's going to talk briefly to give her perspective about the workshops. So over to you, Helen.
Hi guys. So when it came to the things that we learned as digital ambassadors, our first obstacle within the process of developing these workshops was trying to transform digital literacy into a non-academic term, because without this it was going to be very difficult for us to get students to really understand what the relevance was to them and why it could be used in a non-social kind of way. And because our university has more than one campus, which covers the arts, architecture, social sciences, law, business, etc., and computing and so on and so forth, each of the kind of participants that came to our workshops all had different expectations and approaches and concerns as to what it was that they were looking for when addressing the whole idea of digital literacy. And through this, it was it was also reinforced in our own workshop meetings through the different ambassadors that were on the team, that we all had different apps and technologies that we used to further our education, and also how we used it was also very different. And we also then came to the conclusion that if we had teamed up with specific faculties, we could try and one, approve our attendance record, and two, also give content that was more, kind of understandable and relatable for the students to use in their own spheres. And also by getting academics involved, they could also learn certain, new tools and stuff to be able to deliver their content, as well as it just being about the students.
Okay, thanks, Helen. I think we're getting towards the real sort of essence of the project and what we want to do, and the workshops confirm this, as Helen said, that it's really a good idea to try to create student-staff partnerships and to embed any kind of development and help for developing digital literacies into subject areas where possible. And I think this is something that has come out also in our talks with our discussions with librarians or academic support staff, that sometimes the one-off kind of extracurricular workshops have a fairly poor attendance. So students tend to take the lead from their lecturers, from their tutors in terms of using technology. So we wanted to try to create to work in two faculties with small pilot projects to create small pilot student-staff partnerships, which would get them together, get some of our digital ambassadors and willing staff in a subject area to discuss digital practice in their area, to talk about the type of digital literacies which are relevant particularly to their area, and as well as trying to embed these into the curricula for students, to actually try to kill two birds with one stone, if you like. So trying to develop staff's awareness, teaching staff awareness of changing practices, and to sort of, if you like, re-examine their digital practice, and perhaps look at ways they could use blended learning to develop further and to integrate digital literacy development for students into what they do. So rather than looking at student development and staff development separately, we think there's a real possibility to integrate the two together, and that this kind of partnership may be something that could be very productive. But anyway, like I say, this is actually where we're at now. So we're just starting to identify some of the staff that we want to work with and that are willing and kind of open to experimenting with this kind of project and this kind of initiative. So what I'll do now is just finally talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we've come across so far. And I was looking at the UCISA Digital Capabilities Survey, and in their executive summary, I came across this description of some of the barriers to developing student digital capabilities, but also staff capabilities. And you'll notice if you look at the parts in red, which I've highlighted, they are exactly the same, albeit in a slightly different order. And I think this mirrors some of the problems and the difficulties we've come up against. There is obviously the lack of money, the lack of resource, and this is still something that at London Met we're working on, trying to get that support. There are the departmental and institutional sort of differences in terms of culture, but the other one, competing strategic initiatives, I think is important, because there's a plethora of different initiatives and projects underway. Currently at the university, it can be very hard to get your voice heard above all these other competing initiatives. And just finally, to move on to some recommendations from our experience, I think. Try to make sure that you can, if you're having a project or planning a project like this, try to get buy-in from senior management before you start, because I think this is something that we've done the wrong way round, in a sense, that we're still trying to get that now and getting closer to it, but it would have helped to have it from the start. Also, identify and communicate with other institutions. We've had some really good meetings with staff involved in similar projects in LSE, in UCL, in the University of Kent. And I think aside from actually sharing practice and sharing ideas, this is really useful in that it gave us a kind of shot in the arm in that it was good to see other institutions facing similar issues and trying out different things, and it was a real motivator to us to carry on with the project. The third thing is to build relationships with staff who get it. So by that I mean you're probably aware of staff in your institution who kind of understand the changing context that they're working in and are willing to try new things, to experiment a little bit. Don't try to work with those people and build relationships with them rather than trying to convert everybody. And the last thing that I want to say, and perhaps the most important, is students have a very powerful voice. So we were constantly reminded by our conversations and our interactions with students about how important it is just to listen. And also to make use of the energy and enthusiasm which they can bring, and to use that as a kind of catalyst to help push and promote your project further. So on that note, I'm just going to leave the last word to Helen.
Finally, I'd say that one of the recommendations that our student digital ambassadors would probably give is that trying to get students engaged is always going to be difficult. But trying to find a way of making the content original and that it has relevance to the subject that they're studying is probably the most important thing that you can do. Because for 3 years of my course, I'm now at the very end, there's always been reiteration about employability, and it's always the same story that gets told. So by creating something that is maybe slightly more relatable to what I'm studying at the moment, will complement the things that I get told by other departments about employability. And I think that by doing that, you'll help the success of your project. But thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thanks, Helen. And just finally, if there are any questions, we'd be really happy to answer them. If Peter and Ellen could feed anything back from the chat which we may have missed.
Okay, thank Jim and Helen, thank you ever so much. That was really fascinating, and it's so good to hear practical and everyday stories. I think one of the sort of themes that was often coming up was this issue of embedding. And I'm just wondering if Jim and Helen, if you like to cast your sort of eyes perhaps into 2, 3 years into the future at London Met, how would you see this being embedded, and what would be perhaps the critical success factors and approaches to getting what you're doing embedded in the institution?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think it would be perhaps first of all an acknowledgement that students do need this support in a fairly in a way that's integrated into their actual courses rather than just some kind of add-on. Because one of the obstacles we've found is really, it actually does come back to definitions, that a lot of people within the university just don't really understand that digital literacy is anything more than they do think it's kind of keystrokes and social media, and they'll say things like, oh, the students all know how to do that, don't they? So it's this kind of acknowledgement that things are changing and that we do need to respond to this. So I would think perhaps having digital literacies in learning outcomes in courses and module handbooks and so on, but also having them built in through virtual learning environments or through the use of various tools, whether that's social bookmarking or Google Drive, or just acknowledging the fact that things have changed, and if staff are encouraged to look at their own practice as well and to sort of reimagine how they do things, I think that would count as a success, just raising the awareness to start with, but also putting it into courses.
Okay, thanks. And there was a question actually there for Helen from Rod about what term you use for digital literacies with students, and it's a good question. And also, I think one for Jim, similar one, with employers, because I've often found employers don't really understand that term, digital literacies.
Well, in terms of digital literacies with students, when it came to trying to find terminology, that was probably one of the hardest things, because we all kind of had different aspects that we saw as most important. And for me, it was, about privacy. My kind of specialty in this is probably more in terms of privacy and social profiling and things like that. So when it came to defining what it was more about breaking it down, and we did actually use JISC definitions and broke down the different areas of digital literacy so that students could kind of see that it wasn't all about things that, librarian folk might be, studying and typing away about, and that it was something that kind of could be broken down into different aspects, and that it covered how they learn, the things that they were learning, their digital profile, all the different aspects. So we did actually use a JISC definition in order to be able to do that, but it was something that we did have to explain in order to make students realize that it wasn't all about terminology and things that they maybe couldn't necessarily associate with the phrase digital literacy. I hope that answered it.
Yep, thanks ever so much, Helen. I think possibly now it's 1 o'clock and we've got to move on now. Many thanks for that. I'm going to hand back to Ellen now, perhaps just to thank you and to introduce Ellie.